All right, you guys. So today is our last lesson of the try. We are talking about direct measurements. This is part 2. We're going to be learning a lot of different measurement tools and how to read those measurements. First up, we have got micrometers. So micrometer is used to measure lengths to the nearest thousandth of an inch, or if you're using a digital micrometer, to the nearest 10,000th of an inch. So micrometers measure something very, very precisely, very accurately. So a couple components that are going to be important for us to know. First is that this kind of longer piece here is the sleeve. And then the circular part, which would spin around the sleeve, is called the thimble. So here's how we're going to read our micrometers. Oh, and also that thimble is going to 25 divisions. So it goes from 0, and then by the time we make a full rotation, we are at 25. So our step 1, we're going to read the largest number that's visible on our sleeve. So in this case, it would be the 4. And you're going to multiply that by 0.1. Your next reading is after that tick mark of the 4, how many extra tick marks do you have until you hit the thimble? So in this case, we have 3 extra tick marks, and then that value is multiplied by 0.025. Then the last reading is where the thimble is meeting the sleeve. So in this case, the thimble marking that is lined up with the marking on the sleeve is lined up at 13. And that number is going to be multiplied by 0.001. Then you're going to add up all those measurements, and that's going to give you your total. All right. So here's our first one. First thing we're going to read is that number that we can see on our sleeve. Now we can only see part of the 3, but if you can't see its tick mark, you don't count it as being visible. So the 2 is visible, and that gets multiplied by 0.1. The next place that you're going to read is the extra tick marks that lead up from that tick mark of the 2 all the way to the thimble. So we've got 3 extra tick marks, and that value gets multiplied by 0.025. The last place we read is where the thimble lines up with the sleeve. So the marking is 1 below 20. So that lines up at 19. That's going to get multiplied by 0.001. So our grand total after multiplying those out and adding them up, we get 0.294, and our label is going to be inches. All right, let's look at B. The thing we read first is the number that has its tick mark visible on the sleeve. So in this case, the 5. That gets multiplied by 0.1. Now, normally we would read any extra tick marks, but because that 5 is very, very close to the thimble, we don't have any extra tick marks beyond the 5. So we're going to count that as a 0. Then lastly, our thimble lines up with our sleeve, 1 tick mark above 5. So we are lined up at 6 on our thimble, and we're multiplying that by 0.001. So adding it all up, we get 0.506 inches for our reading. All right, let's do a couple more. Our first reading is the 6 on the sleeve. Next, how many extra tick marks? And we've got 2 extra tick marks. And then finally, where does that thimble line up with the sleeve? And it lines up at 2. There's our grand total. All right, our last one of this type of micrometer. We can see the tick mark of the 8s. We can see it just kind of barely there right before the thimble. So that's our first reading. We don't have any extra tick marks on our sleeve. So that's a 0 for our second reading. And then lastly, where the thimble lines up with the sleeve is going to be at a 9. So there's our total. All right, next up, a metric micrometer. It's the basic Same concept as a regular micrometer, but we read it a little bit differently because it is metric. So instead of in portions of an inch, we're going to be portions of a millimeter. These symbols go to 50 divisions. So we start at 0, and by the time we wrap all the way around, we end up at 50. So the first place we're going to read, this one's going to be a little different. We've got a top row of tick marks. Those are whole millimeters. So in this case, we've got 5, 6, 7, 8. So we've got an 8 for our first reading, and that gets multiplied by 1 millimeter. The next thing you look at, after that top tick mark, how many extra bottom tick marks do we have? That's either going to be a 0 or a 1. So in this case, here's our 8 for the top. We have one bottom row tick mark that's closer to our thimble. So we are going to have 1 as our next measurement. And that's going to get multiplied by 0.5 millimeters. Then lastly, we're going to read where our thimble lines up with our sleeve, just like before. And in that case, it lines up at 37. So we're lined up at 37. And that final measurement, we multiply by 0.01 millimeters. And then just like before, add them all up. All right, here's our first metric micrometer. We are reading the last tick mark of your top row. We had 10 here. So that last tick mark in our top row is at 11. You're multiplying that by 1. Now, next would be any bottom row tick marks that are closer to the thimble. There aren't any left on bottom that are closer than that 11 was. So our next reading is a 0. Lastly, we're reading where the thimble lines up with the sleeve. We're just 1 tick mark above our 15. So we're going to read that as a 16. And that gets multiplied by 1/100th of a millimeter. All right, adding it all up, our total is 11.16 millimeters. All right, let's look at the next one. First place you read is the tick mark closest to the thimble for your top row. So we had 5, 6, 7 is going to be our first reading, and that gets multiplied by 1. Next, you're looking at the bottom row of tick marks. If there are any that are closer to the thimble than that top one was, which we have 1 single tick mark, we're going to read it as a 1. So again, that second reading for a metric micrometer is either going to be a 0 or a 1, because these represent 0.5 millimeter. So we're going to multiply it by 0.5. Then lastly, we're going to read where our thimble tick mark lines up with our sleeve, which is going to be at 46. That gets multiplied by 0.01. And there's our total. All right, next we have vernier micrometers. These are going to be read slightly different. They're a little bit more specific. They go out to 10,000ths of an inch. So this thimble, just like the regular micrometer, the thimble goes to 25 divisions. Our first 3 steps for our ordinary micrometer, we're going to follow here. So the non-metric one, the first one that we did. Then lastly, you're going to figure out on the vernier scale, which is this scale off to the left-hand side, where that's going to line up perfectly with one of our lines on our thimble. That's our last reading, and that's going to be multiplied by 0.0001 inches, so 1/10,000th of an inch. So they're going to be very specific readings. All right, so for this one, it shows you the full reading. So we had the 3 on our sleeve is read first. That's multiplied by 0.1. We had 2 extra tick marks leading up to our thimble. So 2 is our second reading, multiplying by 0.025. And then next up is where our thimble is going to line up. So we are lined up right here on our thimble. It matches with our sleeve scale. So be really careful. You're reading down here and not up here. So we are lined up at 8, and that's being multiplied by 0.001. Then lastly, and these are going to be given to you guys in a flat manner, we're trying to line up where our thimble matches that vernier scale that's off to the left. So in this case, we are lined up pretty nicely right here. And if I follow that over on my vernier scale, I'm at 0, 1, 2, 3 for that last reading. And that gets multiplied by 0.0001. And then there's our total. All right, so let's read it. It's a little bit nicer to read when it's all flattened out. First place you look is your whole number on your sleeve. So we've got 3. That's going to be multiplied by 0.1. Next, how many extra tick marks do you have on your sleeve? We have 2. That gets multiplied by 0.025. Next, where does our sleeve line up with the thimble? Now for this one, it's kind of different because our sleeve does not line up perfectly with our thimble. We are between 2 readings. So we are between 6 and 7 for that next reading. So just like with yesterday's lesson, where if you fall between 2, you go with the lower, this is the same. So we're going to go with the lower value. We're going to go with the 6. That gets multiplied by 0.001. And then lastly, you're going to find where your thimble lines up really nicely with the vernier scale. So it lines up very well right here. So our last scale, we're reading off to the side here. So be careful about that. Don't read over here. Read on this side. This is our vernier scale. So our last reading, it lines up at 5, 6, 7, 8 is our last reading. And that gets multiplied by 0.0001. And there's our total. All right, next. We've got 4 for our first reading. There it is. We've got 1 extra tick mark on our sleeve. There that is. Next, we fall between 2 tick marks again where our sleeve hits the thimble off to the right there. So we're going to go with the smaller of the 2. So either it was 14 or 13. We're going to go with the smaller. And then lastly, where does our thimble line up nice and neatly with the vernier scale? And it lines up over here at 5, 6, 7 is our last reading. And there's our total. All right, a couple more. 6 is our first reading. We've got 3 additional tick marks on our sleeve. We're falling between 2 tick marks on the thimble again. So we're going to go with the smaller one between 18 and 19. We're going to go with 18. Even though it looks like it's a little closer to 19, you always go with the smaller reading. And then lastly, where does our thimble line up nice and perfect with the vernier scale? We're at 9. And there's our total. All right. 2 is the first reading. 3 extra tick marks. We're lined up nice and pretty and perfect at 22 for this one. So be really careful. Your 0, remember this thimble has divisions of 25. So 0 is the same as 25. So if we're counting down, 0 is at 25. We're at 24, 23, 22. That's how you know where you're ending up with this one. And then lastly, where our thimble lines up perfectly with our vernier scale, we are at a reading of 1 because we're right above that 0. There's the total. All right, last up today, we are reading vernier calipers. So a little bit different of an instrument. You can kind of see the picture here. It looks a little bit different than those micrometers. So when we are reading, first thing you are going to look at is the whole inch divisions. Those are going to be the big numbers on top. So you can see this bigger 3 and the bigger 4. That's the first reading. So you're going to see where your 2 scales are kind of lined up here. All right, so here's where they're lined up. You're going to read the big number that's to the left. So in this case, we're reading the 3. That represents whole inches. So we've got 3 whole inches. The next reading is the smaller set of numbers on that top sleeve. And again, look at where that 0 is lined up. We want to be to the left of that. So that's going to be the 8. That's going to be multiplied by your tenths. So by 0.1. Next, we are going to read how many extra spaces there are between that 8 and where our next sleeve hits. So let's go back and check. Here was our 8. Here's where that next sleeve starts. We're at 1, 2, 3 extra spaces or 3 extra tick marks. That's being multiplied by 0.25. And then lastly, we're looking at where our 2 scales, our main scale and the vernier scale, which is the bottom one, are going to line up. So we are lined up really nice and perfect with our main sleeve or our main scale on top and our vernier scale on bottom. Our tick marks line up very nicely at 15. That's your last reading. So that 15 is going to be multiplied by 0.001. And then here's our grand total. So let's look at a couple. First thing you want to read is the whole number that is to the left of this 0. So here's your 0, the big whole number to the left. That represents your whole number of inches. So you're going to multiply by 1. The next reading is that smaller set of numbers on the top scale. Again, right before you hit the 0 here on the bottom. So we're reading the as 4. And that multiplies by 1/10 of an inch. Next, how many extra tick marks do we have between the 4 and where our 0 hits on that bottom? So we've got 3 extra tick marks, and that's being multiplied by 0.025. Then last up, you're looking to see where your 2 scales line up really nicely. So your main scale on top, where does that line up with the vernier scale on bottom? They seem to line up really perfect and pretty here. So we're not going to read this top number. You're reading the bottom for your very last reading. So we're lined up at 5. And that is our vernier reading. So it gets multiplied by 0.001. And there's our grand total. All right, let's look at B. Our first reading is a 0. And the reason it's a 0, if you guys notice, your big whole number, here's the 1. Here's where our little 0 on bottom comes into play. So since our 1 is to the right of that, that means the whole number that we're reading for the top is a 0. So we don't have any whole inches. The next reading is that smaller set of numbers on your top scale. So again, look at where the 0 lines up. The 7 is to the left of it. So that's your next reading. Multiply that by 0.1. Next, how many extra tick marks do we have between the 7 and where the 0 hits our scale? We've got 2 extra tick marks, so 0.025. And then lastly, you're going to find a spot where your 2 scales line up perfectly. So they're all kind of off, leading up to this one, nice and perfect. And we are reading that at 14. And again, you look at your bottom row of numbers for that. So 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 is where it lines up on that vernier scale, multiplied by 0.001. All right, and there it is. Okay, last couple problems. First reading, your big whole number on top, which is a 1, so you've got 1 whole inch. Next would normally be this smaller set of top numbers here. But looking at where our 0 on bottom lines up, the 1 is to the right of that. So we have a 0 for that next reading. Then how many extra tick marks do we have? We've got 3 extras until that 0 hits on bottom. And then finally, where do our scales seem to be lining up nice and pretty and perfect? Here it is. They're lining up really nicely, and that's at 9. So here's our 10, We're one tick mark before our 10, so we're at 9. And there's our total. All right, last one. We can't see it, but our big whole number on top is the 3 that we can see, but our 0 is to the left of that. So the bigger whole number for that top row that we can't see, that is to the left of 0, is 2, which is going to be our first reading. All right, next is the smaller set of numbers for that top row that is just to the left of where the 0 hits the bottom. So that next reading is going to be a 9. Then any extra tick marks for that top sleeve until the 0 hits. We've got 1 extra. And then finally, where do our 2 scales seem to line up nice and pretty and perfect? Now, sometimes these can go a few different ways, but I would say that in this case, 5 looks like it's lined up absolutely perfect. And there's our last reading. All right, that is it for today. So your assignment for today is all the rest of 5.4 assigned problems, and your homework review that you'll get tomorrow and tests are all going to be on Thursday this week. And our last day of the try is Friday. So make sure you guys take good notes. If you need to go back and rewatch the video, do that. Otherwise, that is it for today.